on to do a mail drop.
Well, at least for once it wasn't me. Usually when these sort of things go horribly wrong, it's my fault.
Oh, well, gotta be honest, I wish it was you. So, hi, welcome. I gotta be honest also, I kind of like not doing a face one for once. I'm really nervous about all the interviews and stuff we've been doing. So, yeah. This one will be fun, and I won't have to like worry about where my hands are and the fact that I realize that I scratch my face 1,000 times. So,
well, certainly one thing I've learned is true since the whole COVID thing is that my number one hobby is in fact touching my face. So,
that I have also noticed, and also my cat likes to get all up in my nose and make it itch all day.
Oh, yeah, same.
Yeah. So, hello and welcome to our virtual Free Comic Book Day. I don't know how much Allison told you, but Free Comic Day is my very favorite holiday of the year. And when it was canceled, I whined and pouted for like a week, and then was like, "Nope, I'm not doing that. We're gonna make something happen." So, thank you for being a part of it, and
sure, thanks for having me.
And if you wanted to just start with telling us who you are and what you do, and go from there.
Sure. I'm Justin Jordan, and I write comic books. I broke into the industry with The Strange Talent of Luther Strode at Image, and I've done 2 more Luther Strode books over there, and then I've also done Spread, Death of Love, and The Family Trade at Image, as well as Reaver and Dead Body Road at Skybound, which is, part of Image, but it's kind of separate.
Yeah.
And I've also done gigajillion DC books over the years. And so right now I do all that and also do Urban Animal over at Webtoons, so free to read online. So well, that's cool. Me.
I gonna fangirl out for just a second. I love me the Luther Strode. That is some of my very favorite stuff, and it is one of the easiest books for me to hand sell. So.
Oh, that's great.
And we go through about a bajillion of them. Like, you want something funny? Here, try Luther Strode. You want something about a kid who overcomes things? Here. You want something violent and over the top? Here you go. So.
Yeah, I'm
My Little
Pony,
but have you seen Luther Strode?
I'm surprised that we're coming up on, I think, 2021 might actually be the 10th anniversary of the trade.
Yay.
So it's either 2021 or 2022. I don't remember exactly, but it's still astonishing to me that the book actually still sells fairly well. We still sell a couple of hundred copies a month across everywhere, which is pretty good stuff for a 10-year-old book.
We sell a lot of it, because your stuff is definitely some of our favorite in the store.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
I don't know. I have an employee who I shall not name, although everyone else probably knows this story. A story about getting a tattoo at a convention, wherein I specifically said, do not get a tattoo at a convention. It's dirty. It cannot possibly be sanitary. And she walked up to the table a couple hours later and was like, "Look, Mom!" And it was a Luther Strode mask. And I was like, thanks for that, kid.
I do appreciate the dedication.
Yes. So just going to go into it with some of the questions that some of my customers have had. What was the first comic you remember buying and enjoying?
That is a complicated question. So one of my very earliest memories is that I was reading, and were we actually doing the recorded Image thing, I would be doing air quotes because I was about 2 years old. But I remember reading a Popeye the Sailor Man comic. It had the Sea Witch and the Goons in it, and that is one of my very earliest memories, period. And it is one of my earliest comic book memories. So what I assume had gone on is that my mom had probably taken me grocery shopping, and while I was riding in the cart, she probably picked a comic book up off the rack that she recognized, which would be Popeye, and gave it to me. And I never actually got away from it. When I was a little bit older, I started getting the Electric Company magazine when I was maybe 5 or 6, and I was in that specifically for Stan Lee's Spider-Man that was in it. and then I would still pick up comic books whenever I could at the grocery store and all that kind of stuff, which I have a medium case of old, so I don't know that many of the younger people realize that you used to be able to get comic books everywhere
Mm-hmm.
in the early 80s when I
Mm-hmm.
was a weein. So I never got away from it. And then when I got to be about probably 12 years old, one of the local bookstores in the county where I live actually started stocking comic books, and that was actually where I started. Actually, I was probably more like 10, because this would have been before the Burton and Keaton Batman.
Mm-hmm.
They started stocking comic books, but they also had like Advance Comics, like the equivalent of Previews, although it was a different distributor. I think it was Advance Comics, and I
Or
would
was
flip
it
through
Capital?
this. Oh, there you go. Yeah. And I would flip through this thing and I would see all these comic books that you would not see on the newsstand, which was my first exposure to like kind of more indie comics and more stuff that wasn't Marvel and DC. So and that particular place also stocked things like the Cerebrus, or however you're meant to
Mm-hmm.
pronounce that, phone books.
Mm-hmm.
And just these massive slabs of things were kind of mind blowing to my little 10-year-old mind. It's funny.
Wait,
I
you read
really like.
Cerebus when you were 9?
I did not.
Okay.
I could not, and I tell you, the only reason I did not read that when I was 9 is that I did not have the money, nor could I convince my relatives to buy it for me.
Mm-hmm.
What I did read at that age was Alan Moore's Swamp Thing and then Dark Knight Returns, neither of which were remotely age appropriate, and I only got
No.
because my family did not understand that comics weren't all for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly that Alan Moore Swamp Thing actually gave me nightmares that occasionally recur to this day. Like it's a brilliant piece of work, but it's maybe a little too brilliant uh, in its horror for that sort of thing.
It's
Um,
funny because I've done several of these interviews this week, and virtually everyone has mentioned that Swamp Thing. At some point in the conversation has mentioned that Swamp Thing.
oh yeah,
So
that's not surprising. That's, I think, kind of one of those. It doesn't get as much notice these days as, like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns and stuff, but I do think that was one of those kind of watershed moments certainly in mainstream DC and Marvel comics where they were really taking a step forward in terms of maturity of the storytelling and stuff. And I think if you're of a certain age, it probably made a fairly big impact on you. I would guess, like, people like Matt and Kelly Sue are probably in the age range where that would also have been a factor.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I would never guess that. So talking about that kind of stuff, what made you want to do comics? Like, at what point did you go, yeah, this is what I want to do? Or is it just one of those things that has always been there after you read those books?
So, it's funny. I was just, actually, while I was waiting for this call, I was sort of talking on Facebook about, I realized looking back, and this is not a new revelation to me, but it did take me until I was in my 20s before I figured it out. As I look back at all the stuff I wanted to do when I was a kid, and it was always stuff that ultimately was about creating, right? So when I was like maybe 6 or 7 years old, I wanted to be a geneticist, and then frankly, flat out, it's the child's version of it because I wanted to make monsters and dinosaurs and stuff. You know what I mean? Like, not how that actually works at all. And then
Mm-hmm.
I got to be a little bit older, and I realized I wanted to be a special effects artist. And again, it was in that aspect I wanted to make monsters and stuff. And I really liked horror movies and stuff, so that was a factor on it. And then I kind of grew into realizing that what I did actually like to do was create. And that was the case in a lot of respects. Looking back as a kid, like I had toys, but my favorite, always go back to it, toy was modeling clay, where I would make people and stuff and my own kind of things out of it. So that was always there. And I realized when I was a teenager that I wanted to write, and I always loved comic books, but I can't draw at all.
Mm-hmm.
And this was pre the internet, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the internet was not widespread.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was kind of thinking of doing is, there was no clear path for me to get into comics, but there was a relatively clear path albeit difficult, between film and television or novels. So I was kind of focusing on that sort of stuff. And then I got into college in 1996, and not too long after that, while I was in college, Warren Ellis started the Warren Ellis Forum, and I somehow drifted into that and the various kind of forums that spawned out of it, and I realized that, oh, I could use this to find artists to, draw stuff, and I could actually do comics. And then I did. I started out doing, which when people ask me about, like, building into comics, I still think this is good advice. I started out writing 5 or 6 page stories, and I kind of reasoned that if I got good at writing short stories, I would be better at writing long stuff. And from a strictly practical point of view, it's much easier, because I didn't have any money. It's much easier to ask an artist to draw 5 or 6 pages than it is to try to get them to, sign on for your 1,000-page magnum opus that you want to write. So I did a lot of self-publishing and small press and anthology stuff for about 10 years before I broke in with Strode. I did a lot of pitches in that time. It was I had probably Luther Strode was. I don't know that anybody at Image knew who I was, but I would guess that Luther Strode was probably the 12th or 13th series that I had pitched them over the years. So yeah, I just never got away from comics. I just didn't have it as a goal till I got into my 20s, because I didn't realize it was a goal I could have.
So have you ever gone back and repitched those ones that they said no to, the first 8?
I have not. It is funny though, because I do still think about some of them. There's one of them that I want to revisit and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's always funny. I do actually have that thought sometimes where I'm like, I wonder if this was, the quality of the thing, or if it was, they didn't know who I am and I'd have more rope now. But I have not actually indulged in that, partly because I think opening up those old pitches would probably be incredibly painful from a creative standpoint. I'm guessing they were not good.
Oh, I can see that. Speaking of storytelling and stuff of that nature, what is the most challenging character that you've had to work on?
It's probably not a character. It's probably so there are 2 answers. The direct answer to that is probably Superman, but that was more a theoretical thing, that like I have an idea of what I think Superman should be, and I just kind of wrote to that. And I didn't write much Superman, right? I only wrote like a short story that was with Riley Rossmo on art. And so 8 pages of Superman is a much different kind of animal than doing 8 issues of Superman or 80 issues of Superman. But I think people have a lot of problem with Superman because, he's kind of this, he can kind of do anything. And I think that trips a lot of people up. And the approach I actually used for it was my thing about Superman is a character. So the question is not what can he do, it's what should he do and what compromises he has to make. And I don't even mean moral compromises. He's just someone who's acutely aware that he can't save everyone, and he also literally wants the best for everyone. He even wants the best for his quote unquote enemies. So in this story, he was actually going up against Bizarro, but how he resolved it was actually by figuring out what Bizarro was trying to do and giving him a non-destructive way to do it, so kind of everybody wins. So that was fun. What I have generally struggled with over the years is doing team books, and a lot of my books somehow morph into team books by default, even if they're theoretically not supposed to be that. So it's one thing when you're writing like Luther Strode, right, where it's mostly Luther and Petra, like for most of it, or Luther and Pete in the early days. Like, that's a fairly easy dynamic to do. When you've got 5 or 6 characters who all need to be kind of serviced in every issue, it's just an immense logistical thing that makes you acutely aware of how little space you have in 20 pages of comics, especially when you're not really allowed to do like 9-panel grids for every page and that kind of stuff anymore. You can, if you're Tom King and stuff, you can get away with it. But most of the times whenever I've tried that, I've been shot down by editorial. So yeah, that has generally been the most difficult thing character-wise, is anything where there are a bunch of characters. And by far the most difficult example of that was when I was writing Team 7, basically because it was the first time I had ever tried to do that. And a lot of your career as a comics pro is often doing something for the first time in front of an audience, as it were, that you're getting paid for. You haven't necessarily rehearsed some sort of stuff. So, unless you've written a lot of like team books and stuff, when you get shifted on to doing a team book, you're kind of learning out this new skill, but you're up against the deadline. So like, it's difficult.
What about as far as kind of your process between your own creator-owned stuff versus like Marvel, DC, and the more work-for-hire stuff? How is your process different? And how you approach those?
It is mostly the same. It's just that with my creator-owned stuff, it is mostly the same. So the thing that's different about it at a sort of large level is sort of the limitations that you've got, right? Like, so when I did Luther Strode, and I am going to try to not spoil my own book too much, is I could literally kill anybody I wanted in those books, right? Like, and it's not that I'm particularly bloodthirsty, but like I could.
You can't see my face, but it's.
Yeah, I could kill anyone I want. I could end those books any way I wanted, right? Like, and I am not forced to reset to a status quo, and we didn't for the most part. Like, I mean, we kept kind of revamping what we were about. You just can't do that with like Batman or Superman. You know what I mean? Like at a certain point, there is only so many changes you can make that the reader will accept, that editorial will accept, that you can do. So like, you always know that if you even try to make super extreme changes, you are going to be looking at a reset button down the road. Maybe not when you're writing it, but that's that sort of thing. I remember there was a writer, and I'm not sure. I don't remember who it was. I've got 2 or 3 people I think it was, but he was talking about, he'd been asked to pitch for the Flash, and he was, talking about what he had pitched them was like, well, the Flash gets a leg blown off and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, and if you were doing your own thing, like that's an interesting idea. Like, what does a speedster do if they lose that part of their speed? But you can't do it with the Flash. If you do it with the Flash, like at some point the Flash is just going to have both legs again, and it kind of hollows that out. And I think being aware of that to begin with is something that you always need to keep in mind when you're doing kind of work for hire work. So it's one of those things. There's this additional calculation in a work for hire work about kind of what the implicit rules of the universe is and where you're going to leave this character when you're done, and what has been done with the character before, right? Like with some characters, like there's nothing new under the sun. Like there's a particular person's take on it, and style can be different. But at the fundamental end of the day, over 80 plus years of Batman, pretty much every version of Batman in broad strokes has been done. There are not any stories you're not going to be able to find that somebody can't say, oh, that sounds like this story with Batman. Like, that's not how that works. So I think it's partly a matter of knowing, with work for hire, it's knowing what the demands of the universe and demands of this kind of story you're telling are, plus what the history of the character is, and trying to find something that feels new to the reader, even if it's fundamentally not necessarily, which is tricky. That's not as different from creator owned as it sounds, though, because when you do creator owned, you are telling a kind of story, right? Like, so even though I can do whatever I want in Luther Strode, once I started writing Luther Strode, there are just implicit rules to the universe and just things that a Luther Strode book, to me, needed to be. Other writers might not feel that way, but I do, right? So there's just stories I wouldn't tell in a Luther Strode story, and there's just events that wouldn't happen. So that is not super dissimilar in that regard. Now, on a mechanical nuts and bolts level beyond that, my actual process is pretty much the same, which is I'll do a sort of quasi-prose version of what the story should be for a given arc, or a series of arcs, and then I'll bust it down into issue by issue, like a paragraph or two about what needs to happen in that issue, and then I'll break down page by page what needs to happen on each individual page, and then I write it. I don't typically send that page by page breakdown to editorial anymore, because I have found that over the years it doesn't help and it just slows the process down. Because I would get real frustrated because I would turn in a script that was the same as an outline, which was a page by page beat outline, and then they would ask me to change stuff that they should have caught in the outline. And sometimes you just fail to execute, right? But sometimes it's like you either didn't read this or didn't think it through or whatever. But like in any case, I have burned a week waiting for notes when I could have been writing the script. It is just faster to go to script and fix that than it is to try to fix outlines. I've found a lot of the time. So that part, yeah, it's still fairly similar.
Are there any characters that you would just love to work on, that you would love someone to call you up and be like, I need you to write this story?
Sure. I try to convince DC to let me write Lobo literally once a quarter. About every 3 months, I send them an email that was, you should let me write Lobo, which they have not as yet.
Can you put a little note on there that says, Gabi says so too?
I certainly will in the next one I'm about to do. So I love Lobo too, and I feel like to branch off on a tangent, I felt like they sometimes try to overthink Lobo. Right? Honestly, like I was like, he's not a complicated character, and you can find ways to use him the kind of satirical and parodic way that he was intended, but you don't really need to change the character himself. You just need to fold the situations around him. But like, yeah, like, maybe I'd mess it up, but like if there's anybody whose career certainly in creator-owned comics would indicate that writing Lobo is up there in their skill set, I am that guy. Like, and there are others. I would like to write. I have an interesting idea for an interesting take on Bane. I have one for Azrael to get out of DC. I wouldn't mind taking a stab at Punisher or Daredevil over at Marvel. I tend to gravitate towards those street level characters. There are exceptions though. I actually have what I think would make for a pretty good Hercules series in me as well. So those kind of characters I would. But I think number one is probably Lobo, and then Bane are probably like the big 1 and 2 for me.
I don't have any idea how old you are, so I don't know if you remember the product that DC put out 30 years ago, 20 years ago. And it was Lobo's Thoughts on the Universe. And it was just it was shrink wrapped. And when you opened it, it was just a notebook. It was just empty.
I don't, but that's actually kind of brilliant.
Yeah, that is one of my very favorite possessions. But it speaks to what you're talking about. He's not real complicated. Like, no. He wants what he wants, and he will do what he wants to do, and that's pretty much him. And he likes his dog.
And I mean, if you go back and read the Lobo comics from the 90s, the ones that were real successful, like the Christmas one and the Last Sarnian and stuff, like they take the same, and this actually applies to the Punisher in a different sort of way. Is like the trick to making those Lobo stories work, I think, was in the supporting characters, right? Like, you're getting most of that kind of stuff from them, while Lobo just remains a maniac, which is kind of what to an extent Garth Ennis did when he was doing Punisher, which, not that he didn't dive into the Punisher psychology, but a lot of those stories in the Max stories are as much about the supporting characters and how the situation the Punisher has gotten into is affecting them as they are about the Punisher himself, which I think is one way to make a character like that work.
Yeah, I'm big fan of. I would love it if you wrote Lobo. Not to fangirl out all over you. Punisher would be fine, and those other ones would be great. But oh god.
Well, I will tell you, just to make it even worse for you, like Trad and Felipe and I have all talked about, like, man, it would be great if they let us all do Lobo together, right?
If they do, will you come sign here and release it?
Yeah, absolutely will. So I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon, but it would be grand if it did.
Oh, yes. Excellent. Very good. So, sorry, I got sidetracked. So are there, like, when you approach the differences and creator own and work for hire and things like that. How do you approach, like, I assume with your creative stuff, you approach the artist. And
Yes.
huh?
Yes.
And so when you approach an artist, are you more in the headset of you're trying to find someone to collaborate with, or you're trying to find someone to like just work for hire, or how does that process work, and or how do you make that decision?
Oh, I always want it to be a collaboration. And a lot of it is, even when I am working on work for hire stuff, to the extent that it's feasible, I always encourage the artist on work for hire stuff to be like, basically, like, some of these are essential plot beats and they need to happen at this point in the story, but like the how they happen is not as important, right? So as a way of, for instance, a lot of Luther Strode, like Luther Strode in its entirety was written, with the exception of a few pages, almost all of them were written as 6-panel pages. You will notice if you crack open an issue of Luther Strode, there are a lot that are way more than that,
Mm-hmm.
or sometimes less. And some of the
Mm-hmm.
less is me, but a lot of it was trad, just adjusting on the fly. And that's one of these things, like, there's this rhythm to the story that needs to happen, but like what you're putting in each specific panel is, as long as the storytelling is clear, is less important to me. And I encourage artists to do that. And certainly on creator-owned books, I also like them to be as involved in the actual story and figuring out what those plot beats are as they want to be. And it may surprise you. It kind of surprises me. Is there are some artists who just don't want to do that. They would not prefer not to be involved on that level of the creation of stuff, which is fine too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, whenever I'm looking for an artist, for a creator-owned book, certainly where I'm involved in the choosing the artist, I'm looking for the right artist for the book, and some of that is, I tend to write loose sort of scripts in that they talk about like John Wagner writing Dredd, and it's like his things are like Dredd punches a guy in the face, and that's basically how my panel descriptions typically are. So it's fairly important, especially on creator owned, to just choose the right person, and that they are interpreting the scant kind of stuff that I give them, because I like to kind of look at it as like a framework for them to do their thing, rather than me trying to dictate to them every
Mm-hmm.
last detail of it. I am not an Alan Moore type of writer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get paid for the word by the word. So, but just generally, I feel like it leaves it more open to sort of a collaborative effort and that kind of thing. With work for hire stuff, you are limited to the extent you can do that, and there are often other demands in work for hire that can sometimes come up in creator owned. But for instance, a lot of the time in work for hire stuff, I will not necessarily know who the artist is going to be, and I will not know if they speak English as a first language, and things like that. And some of that is stuff like, it's not even a matter of how well they speak English, but like, for instance, came up, it actually came up yesterday. I was writing a thing, and it's an urban animal, which I do with my buddy John Amore, and John is from the Philippines, and John speaks perfect English. You would never know he wasn't an American from the way he speaks. But there's things like, I was talking about guys living in a trailer, like, a mobile home, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if that translates. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that's a specific sort of thing, because I know in Australia they would call that a caravan, for instance. So there's things like that. So when you don't know who the artist is going to be, you need to be thinking about that kind of stuff. So oftentimes in my work for hire, while if I do know who the artist is and I can encourage them to do their own thing, I need to be both more specific in kind of how I write panel descriptions, and also less colloquial in
Mm-hmm.
sort of the descriptions and stuff that I use. And some of that is also, the flip side of that is, when you start working with an artist, there are artists you just kind of groove with, and you can get a sense of the degree to which you need to give sort of instructions. So as the longer I worked with trad, the more scanty the scripts got in terms of description. Like, a lot of the panel descriptions in the third Luther Strode are literally 3 or 4 words, because trad knows what the story is. We worked out the story together, and he knows what needs to go on. So it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't necessary to do that. In work for hire, that is rarely the case.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything right now you're reading that you're just loving? Or anything you think is kind of going under the radar?
Oh, that's a good question that I absolutely cannot answer. And it's just because my brain is fried and I don't know the answer to it. The other problem is that I'm always several months behind on anything that I'm reading comic book wise because I live in the middle of nowhere and I basically just go to the comic book shop about 4 times a year and I just stock
Wow.
up on whatever. So my answer is going to be whatever I was reading like 4 months ago. And actually, it's longer than that since I've been kind of trapped. My February-ish time frame, I didn't get to go, so I have not actually probably read a new trade since November.
Yikes. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm the wrong person to ask. There's some stuff out there that I think is really super cool. I really liked maybe in the under the radar thing. I really liked Thumbs by creators I can't remember, but they also did The Few at Image, and
Mm-hmm.
Hayden is the artist. Hayden something.
Mm-hmm.
Sean something possibly. In any case, see, brain shot.
But
I
also later where you are than here is my
That's
understanding.
true. Yeah. And it's been a day, but aren't they all these days?
Yes. Well, and especially if you're reading The Few, which is, another dystopian.
And there's stuff coming
Sean
out
Lewis,
that
by the way.
there you go. Thank you. Yes. And I quite like that. I am still really digging Monstrous. I think is
Nice.
really pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Really good world building and stuff and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think what last did I read?
If you take Swamp Thing out, because like duh, what are your top 3 books of all time?
Oh man. So probably in terms of trades, I think it's actually going to go. It's probably Dark Knight Returns,
Mm-hmm.
Born Again, probably Planetary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Sorry.
Warren Ellis, for somebody who I don't actually particularly write all that much like, I have
Mm-hmm.
Warren Ellis has been a really central figure in my career, and not just because he created the forum that is at least is pretty directly responsible for being in comics.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny. I don't know Warren, one of the few people in comics that I don't really haven't met at all. But
I met him.
so it's always kind of funny because Warren has the same problem. I say problem. I get this impulse that like I too always want to be chasing after the shiny new object. But with Warren Ellis, I feel like a lot of times you can read his books and you see when a certain point when it really feels like he has lost interest in the book, which is kind of frustrating. So several of his things are like half awesome and half pretty good because he's good at what he does, but like they feel kind of truncated. Like Freak Angels ended up being that way too, and honestly, Planetary suffers a little bit from that. Like the first maybe 2 trades worth of Planetary are some of the best comics ever written, and
Mm-hmm.
the remaining of it is just very good, which
Mm-hmm.
you know is kind of how it is. There are some weird single issues here and there that also made an impact on me. There's one by it is by Alan Moore actually that I really liked, which is Majestic at the End of Time, which is literally what it says on the label. It's Mr. Majestic from the Wildstorm universe,
Mm-hmm.
just living through the end of the universe. He's made it to the end, and it's just a quiet kind of meditative story that always really made an impact on me. And then there's been a few things like that have come up. I also really really love 100 Bullets. I'm a big crime guy, fiction, not so much the actual committing crimes to the extent that I'm willing to admit to on a recording. So I really like that kind of stuff. And then of course, Garth Ennis, Punisher Max sort of thing. And then particularly the end, Long Cold Dark, I thought was and Valley Forge pretty pretty amazing in that sort of thing. Yeah, Garth Ennis, it's funny. Garth Ennis is sort of a mixed bag for me. I am one of the very few comic book people that does not particularly like Preacher. I like Steve Dillon's art a whole lot, but there are kind of two Garth Ennises, and there's mature Garth Ennis, and then there's 13-year-old toilet humor Garth Ennis, and I just do not resonate with 13-year-old toilet humor one. So, like, I like The Boys, the television show, about 1,000 times more than I like The Boys, the comic book series. And I could never get into Preacher because there are admittedly like truly great bits of Preacher, but there's also just stuff where I'm like, yeah, it's just not funny. He did thread the needle for me on Hitman, though. And I think Hitman, because it had to be rated like PG-13, might actually be why it works. But like Hitman is funny and it works for me, which is not usually the case for Ennis's stuff. Sorry, I've rambled on about that particular tangent.
No, okay. You can ramble on all you like. We're here to talk to you. I was so enraptured in what you were saying, I totally lost my train of thought. So when you're talking about working with trad and how not specific you get, are there times with the artists that you feel like you have to get really, really specific, or do you just like maybe I don't know how to say it, but are there artists, and please don't name them, that you feel like you're just not getting it and you feel like you have to do rewrites, or is there a point that you just say maybe they have the vision and I don't, and let it go?
All of the above.
Okay.
So there are times, even for trad, where I would kind of I would describe something specific in a panel. It depends on the book to a certain extent too. So, like, for instance, if you read Spread, the second and third pages of the book are a spread, appropriately enough. And the actual panel description, and technically that's a single panel, the actual description of that is like 3 pages in the script, because there is a lot of important stuff going on in there that also doesn't necessarily exist in the real world, which is also like a tricky sort of thing. So like in Luther Strode, for the most part, like it's taking place in the real world just at a heightened level. So most of the time you don't need to super describe something, even if it weren't trad. Other books, that is not the case. So there's that. And yeah, sometimes there are just artists with whom you get along and you can put out a good product, but like it's not the same sort of easy rapport you develop with other artists, and you just find that you're naturally sort of putting more into panel directions and that. And you know, as you work with an artist, you also kind of learn too. Like you will also learn that there are like, I want this panel, and I know if I leave it with this description, they're going to do X, but what I want is Y, and I think Y is better. And then you do that. And there are some times when the artist kind of goes off the reservation, and it's much cooler than what you were anticipating, so you just roll with it and take credit.
That's cool. Is there so one of the customer questions is, what do you like to listen to or watch while you're working?
Not a blessed thing. Which I realize is a boring answer. Yeah, so the problem is, I say problem, it's just how I am, is when I am writing, even if I have other stuff on, I don't hear it or see it. So I just don't at this point. I get completely focused on what I'm writing or doing, which is typically the case for me in a lot of things. Like that's like people were like, you know, if I'm out lifting weights or stuff, and then people are like, well, do you listen to stuff out there? I'm like, I don't. And for exactly the same reason, because I would only be listening to stuff in between sets, like, because when I'm actually like working and stuff, like I just won't hear it. So yeah, I don't listen to anything or have the television on or anything typically.
Is there anything else that you would like to talk about or question? I don't know why I'm asking questions, or anything that I have missed that you want to talk about, any upcoming things or Free Comic Day, cool stories or anything like that?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I've got it's not helpful to you as a shop owner as yet, but I've got Urban Animal, and we'll be coming back with that in a couple of months. But that's, you know, that is currently we've got 56 episodes up, which works out to about 18 issues worth of comics if you were to translate that in the print. So that's a solid thing. Free comic book day. So I did a free comic book day years ago where we actually were in New England. And I say New England rather than the state because we were actually in that one day I was in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, briefly in Maine, doing stuff. So, yeah. It was funny. We were, it was the year that David Peterson and Archaea released the Mouse Guard hardcover free comic. And so David Peterson was also there. And it was funny because certainly in the, I think it was the New Hampshire leg of that, like they kind of made Free Comic Book Day into sort of a big event that was like a town-wide thing. So we had a bunch of people coming in and a bunch of kids coming in. And as it turns out, kids absolutely do not care who signs their comics. So we would have kids coming up with Mouse Guard and be like, sign this, please. And, you know, once or twice you like try to be like, I didn't work on this, and they don't care. And so me and Trad was there. We ended up signing David's Mouse Guard stuff, and eventually we started leaving notes to David in the Mouse Guard books because they would eventually get to him. That was fairly entertaining. There was also a weird situation where we went outside and this baby squirrel ran up on a girl's shoulder and just sort of hung out there. So that was cute.
She's a Disney princess.
Clearly.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for being a part of our Free Comic Day celebration. I don't know if because I've had many interviews, I don't know if I told you that Free Comic Book Day is my favorite holiday and the most important day of the year to me. So
as well it should be.
When it was canceled, I was pretty bummed. Well, I'm not sure that I explained the full extent of how important it is. When people were like, the year I married Eric, they were like, but what about this day? And I was like, I really like him and I'm really happy I'm marrying him, but I'm not changing my answer. So, but he knew what I was getting into when that happened. So, but thank you very much for taking the time, and I appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to that Lobo project, DC Comics.
Hell yeah, get on the horn with them.
Huh? Yeah, I'm gonna call them up. I probably shouldn't say this while we're recording. I'm gonna stop recording.